Have you ever wondered what happens when a billionaire is treated like a suspect for simply jogging in the park? What if, in an instant, everything you've worked for, your reputation, your status, your peace of mind, is questioned by a single, unwarranted assumption? Terrence Foster, a man who had spent his life building an empire, was about to find out. In that park, on that seemingly innocent morning, his world would flip upside down, and the consequences of this encounter would send shockwaves through his life, forcing him to confront a truth he never saw coming. In this story, you'll witness an incredible journey filled with unexpected twists, powerful revelations, and hidden truths that will change everything you think you know. Terrence Foster, a billionaire accustomed to control and luxury, is thrust into an unimaginable situation when his routine jog takes a dramatic turn. What follows is a confrontation that shakes him to his core, forcing him to confront not just the police, but the very system that has allowed his privilege to go unchecked. Along the way, a mysterious figure, someone who's watched from the shadows, will prove to be the key to Terrence's awakening. Terrence Foster stood at the edge of a quiet park, the first light of dawn casting a soft glow over the empty pathways. His jog had become a sacred ritual, a moment where he could leave behind the weight of his billion-dollar empire and simply exist as a man. The park, nestled in the heart of the city, was a patchwork of green tall trees swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves rustling like whispers in the cool morning air. A few stray dog walkers and early risers passed by, but for the most part, it was just him and the hum of his thoughts. Terrence had everything a person could want: wealth, power, influence. Yet there was a nagging emptiness that clung to him like a shadow. Beneath his polished exterior, he longed for something more: peace, silence, a life not defined by the constant demands of boardrooms and public appearances. But every time he tried to step away from the spotlight, it felt as if the world was pulling him back in. This morning, like so many others, was meant to be an escape, a fleeting moment of normalcy. As his feet hit the gravel path, a steady rhythm began to settle his mind. The world outside of the park seemed distant, irrelevant. But deep down, Terrence feared that no matter how far he ran, he could never escape the truth. That he was seen not for who he was, but for what he represented. A figure of power, of control, of wealth. And that, despite all he had achieved, would never allow him to feel truly free. Little did he know, today would be the day everything changed. Terrence's steady jog took him past the familiar trees and benches, where he'd often rested, watching the occasional runner or dog walker go by. The quiet of the park seemed to settle deeper into his soul, each breath of fresh morning air helping to clear the lingering fog of the previous week's work. The weight of the city's skyline, looming in the distance beyond the tree line, felt less imposing in the stillness of dawn. His rhythm was uninterrupted, his thoughts scattering like leaves in the wind, when a strange feeling prickled at the back of his neck. At first, he chalked it up to the sudden change in his pace, the quick shift from his usual high-intensity workout to this casual jog. But as he passed the park's tennis courts, something caught his agile figure standing still at the entrance near the parking lot. At first, Terrence thought it was just another early morning walker, someone who had arrived to start their own quiet morning routine. But this figure wasn't moving. It was stationary, watching him with a stillness that felt a little too deliberate. Terrence slowed his pace, his eyes subtly shifting toward the man who seemed to have no other purpose but to observe. The man didn't make any move to approach, but his presence lingered like an invisible tension in the air. Terrence pushed the thought aside, deciding that it was just his mind playing tricks on him. He had done this jog 100 times before, and nothing out of the ordinary had ever happened. The park was his safe haven, his moment of reprieve from the relentless demands of his life. It had always been this way, until now. As he continued along the path, the feeling grew stronger. His instincts told him to pay attention, to acknowledge something in the air. But what could it be? His mind began to race, picking up on every minute detail, the way the air seemed to thicken, the sharpness of the morning chill that suddenly felt too sharp. Was he being paranoid? Little did he know, his calm routine was about to be shattered by something he couldn't have predicted. A sound broke through his thoughts, the low hum of an engine coming from behind him. He turned just as a patrol car eased its way into the parking lot, its engine a steady thrum that seemed to reverberate through the stillness of the park. At first, Terrence didn't think much of it. Police cars patrolled the area occasionally, making sure everything was in order. It was a routine part of park security. But as the car slowed to a stop, he couldn't shake the odd feeling that had settled in his chest. The car parked near the entrance, right by where the man had been standing moments before. The figure in question was now gone, hidden behind the row of bushes lining the path. Terrence's heart gave an involuntary thump, and the once peaceful morning suddenly felt charged with tension. Was there something he was missing? Why did the officer seem to be lingering in the area? He watched as the two officers stepped out of the vehicle, both dressed in standard-issue police uniforms. One was tall, lean, with dark hair, while the other was slightly shorter, stockier, with a more relaxed posture. They didn't appear to be in a hurry, but they did seem focused on something, or someone. Terrence couldn't see their faces clearly, but they seemed to glance in his direction before talking amongst themselves in low voices. Terrence instinctively slowed his pace, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling once more. This wasn't right. Why had the officers singled him out from all the other park-goers? The odd feeling of being watched surged again, and this time, it wasn't just a fleeting sensation. His mind started connecting dots that didn't make sense. Too many eyes on him. Too much tension in the air. He glanced around, wondering if anyone else had noticed the unusual scene. There was an elderly woman walking her dog further down the path, and a young man stretching by the tennis courts, but no one seemed to pay attention to the officers. Terrence's instincts told him to keep running, to move past this and let the feeling go. He could finish his run, go home, and dismiss it all as a bizarre coincidence. But as he turned his gaze back toward the officers, something made him stop. One of them, the taller officer, had taken a few steps in his direction. His posture was calm, but something in his approach felt off. It wasn't urgency he was walking with, it was something else. A kind of detached purpose, as if the officer already knew who he was, already knew what they would find. Terrence's mind began to race, but what he didn't realize was that this wasn't a random encounter. The officers weren't just concerned about routine park security. There was something deeper at play, something tied to assumptions they had already made about him. The man they had seen jog by just moments earlier was, in their eyes, a puzzle. One they were intent on solving, whether he wanted to be involved or not. The officer's steps slowed as he approached Terrence. A faint smile on his face, but it wasn't one of politeness. No, this smile felt cold, calculated. It was as if the officer was already preparing for something, preparing to ask questions, to dig into details that didn't concern him. The officer's partner stood a little farther behind, his arms crossed, watching from a distance but clearly, waiting for the right moment to intervene. Terrence's stomach clenched, his mind spinning with confusion and frustration. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He was simply out for a jog. He had done this thousands of times before without incident. So why now? Little did he know, the simple act of running through that park on a Saturday morning would force him to confront something far greater than just a case of mistaken identity. It would push him to the very edge of his own understanding of the world, of power, and of the assumptions that came with it. He could feel the shift, the invisible line crossing into uncharted territory. The officers hadn't spoken yet, hadn't said a word that would give him any clue as to why they were watching him so intently. His jog was slow now, his breath heavy as he tried to maintain his composure. But everything around him seemed to close in, narrowing his focus onto the men ahead of him. The taller officer took a step forward, then another, stopping just short of Terrence's path. His gaze was sharp, inspecting, as if trying to decode the reason for this encounter, searching for something, anything, to justify the situation. And that's when the unsettling question hit him. Why was he being singled out? Why now? Of all times, had the peaceful park, his sanctuary, been disrupted by this odd confrontation? As the officer's shadow fell over him, Terrence knew the answer wouldn't come easily. And perhaps, more unsettling than anything, was the realization that he couldn't just run away from this one. He was already too deep. Terrence's breath came in shallow bursts, as he stood frozen, his legs still positioned in a slow jog. The officer's steady gaze was unnervingly focused, like a hawk ready to swoop in. Every muscle in Terrence's body screamed for him to keep moving, to continue his routine as if nothing was wrong. But something told him that ignoring the situation would only make things worse. The peaceful morning he had longed for seemed so far away now, replaced by the palpable weight of tension in the air. The officer's partner, the shorter, stockier one, stood a few feet behind, his posture almost too relaxed for someone supposedly in control of the situation. He kept his arms crossed, his eyes darting between Terrence and the taller officer. But there was something unsettling in his silence, something that made Terrence uneasy. Why wasn't the second officer speaking? Why was he letting his partner take the lead? The taller officer stepped forward again, closer this time, his presence imposing. "You mind if we ask you a few questions?" he asked, his tone just above polite, but with an underlying layer of authority. Terrence remained still, unsure how to respond, his mind racing. He was about to open his mouth when a movement in the corner of his vision caught his attention. Across the park, a few yards away, a woman was standing by the community garden, her phone raised and pointed in his direction. She hadn't been there when he started his run, but now, she was clearly watching the interaction between him and the officers. Her presence seemed casual, almost as though she was simply an observer. But the way she held her phone, the stillness in her stance, suggested something more. Terrence's mind buzzed with questions. Who was she? Why was she recording? Could she be a bystander? Or was she somehow involved in what was happening right now? Before he could analyze further, the officer's voice snapped him back to the present. "Sir, we just need to verify your identity," the taller officer said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You're out here, shirtless, in the early hours, in an area that's rarely populated at this time." He paused for a moment, clearly weighing his next words. "Do you live around here?" Terrence's throat tightened as he processed the question. Was this really happening? Why was this officer speaking to him, as if he didn't belong here? He was a regular at the park. He had been for years. But now, his simple jog had become a spectacle, an event. He took a deep breath, keeping his voice calm and steady. "Yes, I live in the neighborhood," he said, trying to avoid sounding defensive. "I'm just out for a morning run, like anyone else." The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder at his partner, who still stood silently, his eyes unreadable. Then, the officer turned back to Terrence, scrutinizing him for a few moments longer. "Can you show us some identification?" the officer asked, his gaze piercing. The second officer remained a silent figure in the background, his stance seemingly relaxed. Yet there was something about him that unsettled Terrence even more than his partner's intense questioning. Terrence felt the familiar weight of his wallet in his pocket and briefly considered showing them his ID. But something inside him hesitated. Why was this happening? Why did they need to verify something as simple as his address? He was just a man jogging in the park, no different from any other early riser, no different from any of the regulars who came here every morning. But then, as the officer's gaze flicked back toward his partner, Terrence had an unsettling thought. What if this wasn't about him at all? What if there was something else going on here, something bigger that he hadn't seen yet? The seconds dragged on, and finally, Terrence decided to comply. He pulled out his driver's license from his back pocket, offering it to the officer. As he handed it over, he noticed something. The officer's partner was now looking at the woman across the park, the one with the phone. Their eyes met for just a fraction of a second. Terrence couldn't quite read the exchange, but the subtle glance unsettled him. The taller officer took the license and handed it to his partner without looking at it. His partner inspected it slowly, as though the piece of plastic held some kind of mystery. Terrence's discomfort grew with each second that passed in silence. What was going on? Then, the second officer spoke, his voice low and controlled, but there was a tension in it that hadn't been there before. "This your address?" he asked, as he read the details off the license, his voice steady. Terrence nodded. "What unit are you in?" The officer pressed further, his eyes narrowing. "Unit 412 bytes. Terrence answered. "I've lived there for over 2 years now." There was a long pause as the officer processed this. Was it really that hard to believe? Terrence thought. He knew that people often assumed wealthy people didn't live in humble areas, but he had done nothing wrong. Why was this becoming so complicated? The officer looked at him again, and for a split second, Terrence saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes, followed by something else, something like suspicion. The officer's lips curled into a slight frown as he passed the ID back to his partner, who was now scribbling something in a notebook. "But the thing is," the officer continued, "you don't seem like the kind of person we usually see jogging here at this time of day." The words hung in the air, heavy with the unspoken accusation behind them. "We just have to make sure everything's okay. Everything's okay." Terrence's mind spun in disbelief. What was that supposed to mean? As the officers spoke to each other in low tones, the woman across the park shifted position, subtly adjusting her phone. What was she filming? Terrence couldn't tell. But one thing was clear, she was recording this. He was now certain of it, and that left him with a gnawing question. Why was she recording him? Was she just a curious bystander? Or was she somehow involved in this strange, escalating situation? In the distance, he could hear the faint sound of the park's distant traffic. The world seemed far away. And in that moment, Terrence felt completely alone. But what was truly unsettling wasn't the presence of the officers. It wasn't the woman's gaze from across the park. No, the unease came from the undeniable feeling that he was being scrutinized, his every move analyzed. It felt like a performance, with him as the unwilling star, being examined under an invisible spotlight. "Look," Terrence finally said, his voice growing firmer. "I'm just here to jog, that's it. No one's causing trouble. There's no reason for this." But his words fell into an abyss of silence, and the officers exchanged another look, a look that felt charged with something deeper, something unspoken. The woman across the park lowered her phone for just a moment, her eyes now fixed on Terrence. And for the first time, their gazes locked. There was a brief, fleeting moment when he saw something in her eyes. It wasn't just curiosity. It wasn't just concern. It was something deeper, something personal. And that moment, that brief exchange of glances, only deepened the mystery, leaving Terrence with a dozen unanswered questions. What was really going on here? Why had this simple jog turned into something so complicated? The officers stood there, waiting. But so was he. And for the first time, Terrence realized that the answers wouldn't come easily. In fact, they might never come at all. But one thing was certain. He was about to be forced into a game he hadn't chosen. And the stakes were higher than he could ever have imagined. The tension in the air felt suffocating, like a storm that had yet to break but was building with each passing second. Terrence stood there, his heart pounding in his chest, trying to stay calm. The jog that was meant to clear his mind had instead become a suffocating trap. The officers, though seemingly polite, were creating an invisible cage around him with their probing questions and deliberate silences. The woman with the phone across the park, her steady gaze, not leaving him, only made everything worse. He couldn't shake the feeling that something much bigger was happening. Something he wasn't yet seeing. Terrence shifted his weight, trying to maintain his composure, but his mind was racing. Why was this happening? He was a man of wealth, influence, and respect. He had never been stopped in the park before, never had his identity questioned. So why now? What had changed? The officers were silent now, their eyes flicking between each other, exchanging looks that only deepened Terrence's unease. The taller officer, who had been leading the questioning, now seemed distracted, almost as if he were waiting for something, perhaps a signal. The other officer, the one who had been quieter, kept his eyes on the woman across the park, his gaze lingering a little too long. Then, the moment that would change everything came. The taller officer suddenly stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he stared at Terrence, almost as if sizing him up. "Mr. Foster," he said, his voice steady but laden with an underlying edge. "We've been getting reports about people jogging around this park early in the morning. There's a lot of concern about ... safety." Terrence blinked in confusion. Safety. It didn't make sense. The park was quiet, empty at this hour, with no real danger. His mind tried to work through the logic, but it was like running into a brick wall. "Safety," he echoed, his voice strained. "What are you talking about? I've been running here for years, and now I'm a threat." The officer didn't flinch at the accusation. Instead, he took another step forward, his presence now intimidating. "We have to follow up on reports, sir," the officer said slowly, "and it's our job to make sure everything's in order." But as he spoke, Terrence's mind caught something in his words, something more than just a simple inquiry about a jogger. It wasn't just about safety or protocol. It was about something else. The officer was now standing right in front of him, a mere arm's length away, his eyes scrutinizing every movement. Terrence could feel his heart rate accelerating, the blood pulsing in his temples. This wasn't just a question about jogging. This wasn't about a routine check. Something else was happening. And Terrence was about to learn what it was, even if it was something he wasn't prepared for. "Tell me, Mr. Foster," the officer continued, his voice dripping with a calm authority. "Do you ever feel out of place in this neighborhood? Maybe not the kind of place you should be." His tone was soft but held a sting, like a well-hidden barb beneath the surface. Terrence's breath caught in his throat. Out of place. What did that mean? Was he hearing right? The words felt like a slap in the face. A judgment passed before he even had a chance to defend himself. He wasn't just being questioned as a routine check. He was being painted as an outsider, as if he didn't belong in the very neighborhood he had built his life around. The second officer, who had been quiet this whole time, now stepped closer, his arms still crossed in front of him. His silence had been menacing, but now it felt like it was leading up to something far darker. The man's eyes glinted with something sharp, something that seemed to pierce straight into Terrence's soul. But it wasn't just the officer's presence that made Terrence uneasy. It was the sudden realization that he was being marked. Marked. For what? Though we couldn't fully understand, but something told him that he had crossed a line that shouldn't have existed in the first place. The taller officer held up a hand, signaling his partner to step back, then turned back to Terrence, his voice cold now, devoid of the polite facade. "We've been getting reports of strange behavior, and you're the one that fits the description." The words hit Terrence like a punch in the gut. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. Strange behavior. He was just a man jogging. Was this really happening? How was it that a simple morning jog, a harmless routine, was now being twisted into something sinister? Before he could gather his thoughts, the officer's partner suddenly spoke up, breaking the silence that had fallen over the group. "Let's see some proof that you belong here," he said sharply, his voice growing more insistent. The words hung in the air, heavy with the implication that Terrence's presence needed to be validated. "Checked, confirmed." Terrence, single quotes, his mind raced. Proof. Proof of what? He had paid for his home, signed the contracts, lived there for years. Yet here he was being asked for proof as if his very existence in the neighborhood was under suspicion. The absurdity of it all was suffocating. His mind flitted to the woman across the park. She was still standing there, her phone in her hand, the camera now angled directly at him. She hadn't moved. Her presence, though silent, had become louder with each passing second. Why wasn't she stepping in? Why hadn't she intervened? What did she know that he didn't? Terrence could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He wasn't sure what game was being played here, but it was clear that the rules had changed. He was no longer just a jogger. He was a suspect in a scenario he hadn't even been aware was unfolding. His mind scrambled for an escape, some way, out of this surreal moment. But as the taller officer stepped forward again, the unspoken tension between them grew unbearable. "We're going to need to check your ID and residence," he said flatly. "Right now. And if you refuse, we'll have to escalate this." The words hit Terrence like a cold wave crashing over him. He had been calm up until now, processing each step, trying to stay composed. But this moment was different. The stakes were higher now, and the price of refusal felt too steep. He couldn't refuse. The air thickened as he reached into his back pocket, pulling out his wallet. His fingers were trembling slightly, but he couldn't afford to show any weakness. As he handed the officers his ID, the weight of the situation hit him fully. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. This was something deeper, something that reached far beyond this park and these officers. He had always feared being seen as an outsider. But now, it wasn't just a fear. It was a reality that was being thrust upon him. And as the officers looked at his identification and exchanged knowing glances, Terrence felt something stirred deep within him. A need to take control. To shift the power balance that had been turned against him. Little did he know, in that moment, a decision was being made. The game had changed, and there was no going back. The officers stood in front of him, their silence now loud, their eyes probing. The woman with the phone across the park lowered it for a moment, her eyes locking with his. For the briefest second, he saw something in her expression, a hint of understanding, a flicker of solidarity. Terrence felt it then, the point of no return. He was no longer just a man being questioned. He was about to become a symbol of the very system that had just put him under suspicion. And, when he finally opened his mouth, the words he spoke were not just for the officers standing before him, but for the whole world that was watching him. Terrence's calm resolve in the face of suspicion turned the tide. When the officers finally acknowledged the truth, that he was indeed a rightful resident, and that their assumptions were wrong, the situation was far from over. The damage had already been done. The video from across the park had gone viral, sparking outrage and widespread discussion about racial profiling, even in affluent neighborhoods. For Terrence, the moment of truth came not in the apology from the officers, but in his decision to speak out. He filed a formal complaint, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been subjected to similar bias and injustice. The local community rallied behind him, and the subsequent investigation led to policy changes in the park's security protocols. Officers were retrained on handling sensitive situations, and a public forum on racial profiling was held for residents. Terrence's once peaceful sanctuary had become the battleground for change. Though it was a painful and humiliating experience, he found something more valuable than peace. He found his voice. His simple jog, turned public spectacle, led to a ripple effect of awareness, forcing his community to confront uncomfortable truths and make necessary changes. In the end, he didn't just reclaim his dignity. He sparked a shift in the system.